So today I read Batman Legends of the Dark Knight Werewolf, parts 1 and 2 by James Robinson and John Walkus. That's part 1. That is part 2. So this was a really interesting story because we get to see Batman in London, which I've never seen him outside of Gotham before, so I thought that was kind of funny, and also the British accents written into the dialogue were kind of amusing. The plot is basically that two people end up getting murdered in Gotham, and their deaths are kind of like were done by a werewolf. So we have this immediately this like concept of the occult is introduced, which is very interesting because Batman is a very scientific and technological based man. Like he doesn't have any supernatural powers. He wasn't bitten by a radioactive spider. He just has like a bat cave and a ton of money and gadgets and suits. And of course his unflinching moral compass. I thought it was very, very interesting to sort of see the confrontation of these two very opposing like concepts when you have like the scientific and the technical and the mechanical versus like the occult, the spiritual, the mystical. So I thought that was super cool. And I think that pretty early on, these two themes are put at odds with each other. Let's see. And I think this is also represented really well in the artwork. In just the opening scenes of the first part, you just have like talking about discovering the body and the first murder, and the art style feels very typical to me. Everything feels very typical comic style. Nothing is very blurred out or ambiguous. But then just on the title page, when we first see an image of the werewolf, look at that. It's like it's almost grayscale, a lot less color. You have these like stratified lines. It looks kind of foggy, and I think that the way that these two opposing ideas are represented in the artwork is really, really powerful. And I'll show another example of that later. But Batman goes to London and he's asking around, and we get introduced to a lot of seedy characters in like the underground sort of criminal network of the city. And we eventually do meet our suspect, Charlie Blake, who we think is the werewolf. They have a fight, he gets away, and we end part 1 on this absolutely terrifying 2-page panel, and this is our first look at the werewolf. I mean, that is some highly effective graphics. Absolutely terrifying. He is towering over Batman, just like the detail on just like the musculature of that animal. It's terrifying. And this is our first look at it, and we think like, okay, this is real. Because Batman's kind of skeptical. You know, he's a man of logic. He's not going to think this is actually a werewolf. Well, that's pretty convincing. So we pick up on part 2. And something that I immediately noticed, just even on the covers, you can look at the difference in how the werewolf is represented. Like here, he's in the back. He is smaller than Batman. We can't really see him clearly. This is telling a very different story. He is overtaking Batman. Like the amount of detail is so visceral, and honestly, the mouth was kind of giving me Venom vibes, which I thought was just a little interesting side note. But you can already see like the progression of this idea of like, okay, this is real. And then of course we open, just in case you forgot what happened last time. And he's fighting the werewolf, and none of the stuff that he has is working. And he has gas, he's trying to apply pressure points, and it just isn't being responsive. I think I might give a spoiler alert on part 3 to talk about that a little bit later. But for me, my favorite part of the second section was when he basically goes out into the woods of London and finds this cult gathering of a bunch of people who are worshipping the werewolf and who believe in these like mystical old world like mythological creatures. And I mean, I love a good bit of occultism. Who doesn't? But their leader, a woman named Raven, I believe, is talking about how like we have old beliefs. We believe in things that are older. He's a primal thing. He comes from before Buddhas and Bibles, before the Jew and Gentiles God. That's what she says. And what I thought was most interesting is that she also calls Batman out a little bit. She says, running around as you do, dressed as a flying rodent, perhaps you might understand after all. Flying rodent is kind of crazy, but she has a good point, because I think that Batman sees himself as very separate from this entire world of like, oh, like you guys believe in this crazy old world thing, and like that's not me. But when you think about it, what is the difference between Werewolf and Batman? They're both like these larger than life myths. I think they're both pretty big parts of pop culture. And I think that kind of juxtaposition and the connection that she draws between them is super interesting. And spoiler alert, in part we find out that the werewolf is actually just like a machine. It's not like a creature, a biological creature at all. And so in that sense, I think it's very interesting to me, because what does that say about Batman? Is he a man? Is he an idea? Is he a sort of an artifice for us to convey different themes, different stories, different messaging? Because he is like such a prominent part of our pop culture. In, honestly, I would say the same way that werewolves are. I just think it's a really cool idea, and I loved the confrontation of something that is like mythological versus something that's supposed to be like mechanical and real and hard, but is it really? Does it really blend like that? And I think that so many Batman comics are really about society and are really social commentary and are much more thematically deep than I think a lot of people give them credit for. Or maybe I'm just overanalyzing, but God forbid a girl for wanting to have some fun. But the story, so the second part does end on a cliffhanger. Once again, we have this big 2-page panel, and it's like the London mob getting ready to murder Batman because they're messing around with his business. I didn't get to read the third one. But once again, the artwork that I pointed out in the first part and how the werewolf is represented differently, that same style shows up again right at the end here. So even just on this other page here, you can see the difference. Here, these are clear lines, mostly solid colors, very like solid, clear, nothing's blurred, and you just like compare that to here. And like the form of the werewolf and the clouds, and you have these like same kind of like lines across the page as in the first part I showed you, and he's sort of confronting the idea of the werewolf, because at this point he doesn't know that it's a machine. He just thinks it's probably like some real kind of biological thing. And I love the visual representation of him trying to parse through like what is real and what is not. I think it is super effective visual storytelling. And yeah, because breaking a pattern is just as powerful as making it, I think, when you're operating in a visual medium like comic books, which is super interesting. But we also get like a look into Batman's moral compass, which is like always going to be something that shows up in comics about him. Like, we understand that he has a very innate sense of right and wrong, and it is pretty inflexible too. He is willing to work with Scotland Yard when he shows up in London, but when he is interrogating Tommy Twist, who's like a mobster character, and Twist says like, oh, like, you know, like, we could work together, I know a lot of guys, and Batman doesn't even consider, he's like, no, and he just leaves, he just goes out the window. That's his modus operandi, I guess. And even that woman, Raven, who he doesn't necessarily like because she's leading this cult, she ends up getting kidnapped by Twist's men, and she's being like tortured and interrogated, and he jumps in and saves her, because that's the kind of person that he is. He has a very innate sense of right and wrong. But I think that because his worldview is so black and white, sometimes that makes him a bit of an inflexible thinker, which I think doesn't really actually aid his detective work. And I think we see that in how he's approaching the problem of the werewolf. I really wish I did have the third part here, because I would love to see what his realization is like when he realizes what it actually is, because I think that would also be really revealing about like his character and mentality. But yeah, he has a very inflexible worldview, and I think it makes sense given everything that happened to him in his youth. But at the same time, we do get these like brief moments with Alfred, which I think are always super informative, because he's a very humanizing character. They're sitting here in the Batcave before he goes to London. They're talking about the man that was murdered because he was Alfred's friend, and we do get the sense that Batman does care about Alfred, and he does care for the people that have died, because they're both connected to Wayne Industries, and he does have like a sense of duty toward his employees. And I love a good Alfred scene, because I think it reveals so much more about the man behind the mask, which, in my opinion, is equally as interesting and important as the character in the image of Batman himself, which is definitely something that gets confronted a lot in this story. You know, what is an image? what does it mean to be so prevalent in the cultural zeitgeist, if you will. And I think that there are a lot more similarities between Batman and the werewolf than he may even realize.